After the USSR collapsed, survival meant sacrifice. He chose belief over bread, and MMM gave him both. For a moment, life felt possible again, until it all disappeared in a single day. Back in the early 90s, life felt like a slow bleed after the Soviet Union collapsed, a wound that wouldn't heal no matter how hard we tried. I was 34, living in a cramped, drafty apartment in Novosibirsk with my wife, Elena, and our 2 kids, Masha and little Sasha, who were just 6 and 4. I worked at a factory that churned out parts no one needed anymore, the pay barely covering a loaf of bread and a bit of milk. The ruble turned into a cruel joke overnight. Stores stood empty with shelves gathering dust, and every day brought news of another collapse, factories shutting down, pensions vanishing into thin air. I remember standing in line for hours just to get a bag of sugar, my hands numb from the biting cold, my breath fogging in the air as I wondered how we'd survive another winter. It wasn't just me. Millions of us were lost, clinging to the fading memories of the old world while the new one offered nothing but uncertainty and long, gray days. Those winters were brutal. The kind where the wind cut through your coat like a knife. We'd huddle under blankets, the kids asking why we couldn't have meat or new shoes, and I'd lie saying things would get better soon. Elena would sew patches on their old clothes, her fingers trembling from the cold, while I stared out the window at the snow piling up, feeling like a failure. The factory shifts stretched into eternity, the machines groaning like they were as tired as we were, and rumors swirled about layoffs that never seemed to end. One night, a neighbor knocked on our door, his face pale, saying his brother had lost his job and they were selling their furniture just to eat. That hit me hard, a reminder that we were one step from the same fate, teetering on the edge of nothing. Then came whispers about a man named Sergei Mavrodi, a name that would soon echo through my nightmares and dreams alike. I first heard it from a coworker, Ivan, a gruff man with calloused hands who'd seen better days. He cornered me during a smoke break one frigid morning, his voice low as he mentioned this guy had started something called MMM, a company that supposedly turned small investments into piles of rubles. He chuckled, saying it sounded too good to be true, but his eyes sparkled with a light I hadn't seen in years. Hope, raw and unfiltered. I went home that night, my boots caked with snow, and sat at the kitchen table with Elena, counting our savings by the dim glow of a single bulb. We had 300 rubles tucked away, hidden in an old jar for emergencies like a doctor's visit or a broken pipe. She frowned, her voice soft but firm as she warned me not to trust strangers peddling miracles, but I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this could pull us out of the hole we were sinking into. Days blurred into weeks, and those whispers grew into a roar. People at the factory started talking about MMM offices springing up like mushrooms after rain, about friends and cousins who'd put in money and seen it double, triple even. I'd walk past one of those offices on my way home, a squat building with a flickering neon sign and a crowd spilling onto the street, their faces lit with a strange, almost feverish excitement. My heart raced as I edged closer one evening, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of nervous chatter, people swapping stories of sudden wealth. I stood there, hands shoved deep in my pockets, feeling the weight of my 300 rubles like a lifeline. It wasn't sadness or fear that pulled me toward that door. It was a desperate, aching need to believe in something better, to give Masha and Sasha a future beyond bread lines and patched-up coats, to see Elena smile again without the shadow of worry in her eyes. That winter felt endless, the cold seeping into my bones. But the buzz around MMM kept me warm with possibilities I hadn't dared to dream of before. I kept hearing stories from neighbors leaning over fences, from coworkers hunched over lunch pails, tales of people walking out of those MMM offices with pockets bulging with rubles, their faces glowing like they'd stumbled into a fairy tale. One evening, Ivan pulled me aside during a break, his breath visible in the frosty air as he showed me a crumpled ticket from MMM, his voice trembling with pride as he said he turned 50 rubles into 150 in just 2 weeks. I stared at that grubby piece of paper, my mind racing with what that could mean for us: new shoes for the kids to replace the ones with holes, maybe even a slab of meat on the table for once instead of watery soup. It wasn't just about money, it was a chance to breathe again, to lift the weight off my shoulders that had grown heavier with every empty shelf and unpaid bill. I talked it over with Elena that night, the kitchen table scratched and worn from years of use, her eyes narrowing as she listened to my shaky explanation. She crossed her arms, her lips tight as she reminded me how scams had ruined others we knew, how we couldn't afford to lose the little we had scraped together. But I caught the flicker of temptation in her too, the same hunger I felt deep in my gut, so I promised we'd start small, just to dip our toes in, to see if this miracle held water. The next day, I skipped lunch, saved the few rubles I'd have spent on bread, and made my way to that office I'd passed so many times, my heart thudding in my chest. The crowd was thicker now. People shouting over each other, some laughing with wild joy, others arguing in heated whispers, all drawn by the same fragile dream. I handed over my 100 rubles, my hands shaking as if I were handing over my soul, and they gave me a receipt with a promise of 200 back in a month. A piece of paper that felt like a ticket to a new life. Weeks pass, each day stretching into the next like a slow torture, and every morning felt like waiting for a miracle to drop from the sky. I checked the news on a crackling radio, listened to the factory gossip, hoping for word on MMM, while Elena grew quieter, her worry deepening into silence that filled our tiny apartment. Then, one gray afternoon, a knock came at the door. A messenger from the office, his voice gruff as he confirmed my investment had doubled. I rushed there, collected my 200 rubles, and ran home through the slush, my heart pounding with a joy I hadn't felt since the kids were born. We bought Masha and Sasha new coats, their eyes wide with wonder, and for the first time in years, we ate a proper meal together, potatoes with a thin slice of sausage, laughing as the kids chattered abo. At school, I started believing Mavrodi was a genius, a man who'd cracked some secret code to lift us from the ashes of the old world, and that night, I lay awake, dreaming of bigger stakes. Of a life where we wouldn't have to count every kopeck or shiver through another winter. The office became my second home after that, a place I'd visit after work, watching others come and go, their stories fueling my faith like a fire catching dry wood. One man, an old pensioner with a cane, shuffled up to me one day, his hands trembling as he said he turned 300 rubles into 1,000, enough to fix his leaking roof and buy medicine for his wife. Another, a young mother with tired eyes, cried as she showed me her earnings, saying it saved her family from starvation after her husband lost his job. I started putting in more, 200, then 300 rubles, each time seeing it grow like magic. And with every success, my trust in Mavrodi deepened, his name becoming a beacon in the dark. He wasn't just a businessman to me, he was a savior, a figure who understood our pain, who'd found a way to turn our desperation into gold. Little did I know that hope was building on sand, a fragile structure ready to crumble beneath the weight of its own promises. But back then, I was blind to anything but the light at the end of the tunnel. That spring of 1994 brought a warmth I hadn't felt in years, not just from the melting snow but from the fire MMM lit inside me. My small wins turned into something bigger, a wave that carried me and so many others toward a life we'd only dreamed of before. I started putting in 500 rubles every month, watching it grow to 1,000, then 1,500, the numbers dancing in my head like a promise of freedom. Elena's frown softened as we bought a second-hand TV, the kids' eyes glued to cartoons, and I started dreaming of a bigger apartment, maybe even a dacha where we could escape the city's grayness. The factory felt less like a prison now, my steps lighter as I walked home, the weight of poverty lifting with every visit to that neon-lit office. The streets buzzed with MMM stories, a fever spreading through Novosibirsk and beyond. I'd meet friends at the market, their voices loud with excitement as they swapped tales of doubling their money, of buying cars or sending kids to better schools. One guy, a mechanic named Yuri, showed me a stack of rubles he'd earned, saying he'd quit his job to invest full-time, his laugh echoing as he planned a trip to the Black Sea. I felt a surge of pride, like I was part of something revolutionary, a movement led by Sergei Mavrodi, a man I'd never met but who seemed to know our every struggle. His face stared out from posters, sharp and confident, and I started seeing him as a hero, a genius who turned the chaos of the 90s into gold for the common man. My family changed too, the tension easing with every payout. Masha and Sasha got new books, their laughter filling the apartment, and Elena began talking about saving for a washing machine instead of scrubbing clothes by hand. I'd sit with her at night, counting our growing stash, her fingers tracing the bills as she admitted maybe I'd been right to trust this. We even hosted a small party, inviting Ivan and a few neighbors, the table piled with sausages and vodka. Toasts raised to Mavrodi's name. I remember Ivan slapping my back, saying I was the smartest guy he knew for jumping in early, and for the first time, I felt like I'd beaten the odds stacked against us since the Soviet fall. The office became a hub of dreams, people lining up with hope in their eyes, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of possibility. I started helping others, showing them how to fill out the forms, sharing tips I'd picked up, feeling like a mentor in this new world. One woman, a widow named Olga, thanked me with tears, saying her 400 rubles had turned into 1,200, enough to pay for her grandson's medicine. I'd walk home with my earnings, the cold no longer biting, my mind spinning with plans: a new coat for Elena, a bicycle for Sasha, maybe even a loan to start a small business. Mavrodi's name was on everyone's lips, a savior who'd given us a ladder out of the pit, and I believed with all my heart that this was just the beginning. Then came the big moment that sealed my faith. I invested 1,000 rubles, a bold move that emptied our emergency jar, and within 3 weeks, it grew to 3,000. I rushed home, spilling the news to Elena, who hugged me tight, her voice breaking as she said we could finally live. We bought a used sofa, the kids jumping on it with glee, and I started imagining a future where I'd leave the factory behind, maybe work for MMM itself. The radio blared ads praising Mavrodi's genius, and I nodded along, convinced he'd cracked some secret of wealth that the old system had hidden from us. My trust in him grew unshakable, a belief that carried me through late nights and early mornings, blind to the cracks forming beneath our feet. People from other cities started showing up, their stories adding fuel to the fire. A man from Vladivostok said he turned 200 rubles into 6,000, planning to open a shop, while a teacher from Moscow claimed MMM had saved her school from closure. The numbers seemed endless, the possibilities infinite, and I threw myself into it, investing more, encouraging others, my life revolving around that office's glowing sign. I'd lie in bed, listening to Elena's soft breathing, picturing a house with a garden, a life where my kids wouldn't know the hunger I'd endured. Mavrodi became more than a man to me. He was a vision, a leader who'd turned our despair into a golden age, and I was ready to follow him anywhere, unaware that the peak we'd reached was about to collapse into darkness. By the summer of 1994, the era on MMM started to feel different, a subtle shift I couldn't quite place at first. The office still buzzed with energy, people crowding the entrance with their hopes pinned on those receipts, but the laughter grew thinner, the chatter more strained. I'd stand in line, my 1,000 rubles clutched tight, noticing how some faces looked tired, their eyes darting as if waiting for bad news. One morning, Ivan pulled me aside, his usual grin replaced by a frown, saying he'd heard rumors about delays, about people not getting their payouts on time. I brushed it off, telling him Mavrodi was too smart for that this was just a hiccup in a brilliant machine. But a knot started forming in my stomach. The factory buzzed with the same unease, workers whispering about friends in other cities who couldn't cash out. I'd come home, my boots heavy with dust, and find Elena pacing, her hands wringing as she asked if we should pull back. She'd seen a news report, some economist warning that MMM couldn't sustain those returns, that it relied on new money to pay the old. I argued back, my voice louder than I meant, saying Mavrodi had proven it worked, that our 3,000 rubles from last month proved it. We needed this, I told her, needed to believe. And she nodded reluctantly, her trust in me warring with her fear. That night, I lay awake, the kids' soft snores a contrast to the doubts creeping into my mind. Things got stranger at the office, the lines grew longer, but the payouts slowed, staff muttering excuses about system updates or bank delays. I watched an old man argue with a clerk, his voice breaking as he demanded his 500 rubles, only to be told to come back next week. My own 1,000 rubles took an extra day to process, and when I got it, the amount felt smaller, like they'd shaved off a few rubles. I asked around, and others nodded, saying the same thing, their voices low with suspicion. Still, I clung to hope, telling myself Mavrodi was fixing things, that this genius wouldn't let us down after lifting us so high. I invested another 500, hoping to prove my faith, but the knot in my gut tightened. The radio started carrying darker tones, reporters questioning MMM's promises, hinting at a collapse. I'd switch it off, angry at their skepticism, but the words stuck with me. Elena begged me to stop, her hands trembling as she held Masha close, saying we couldn't lose the TV or the coats. I promised I'd be careful, but deep down, I knew I was into deep. The dream of a dacha and a better life pulling me forward. One evening, I saw a crowd outside the office, their shouts echoing down the street, someone yelling that a friend hadn't been paid in weeks. I pushed through, my heart racing, and overheard a clerk whisper that the system was under strain, that more money was going out than coming in. Panic started seeping in, a slow poison I couldn't ignore. I talked to Yuri, the mechanic, who'd quit his job, and he looked pale, admitting he hadn't seen a payout in days, his savings drained. The widow Olga approached me, her eyes red, saying her grandson's medicine was running low because her last investment stalled. I felt a stab of guilt, having encouraged her, and promised to help, though I had no idea how. The office staff grew evasive, their smiles forced, and I started noticing new faces, people I didn't recognize, watching the crowd like hawks. My trust in Mavrodi wavered, but I couldn't let go, telling myself he'd find a way, that this was just a storm we'd weather together. The tension broke one humid afternoon when a man stormed out, waving a receipt, shouting that MMM was a lie. Others joined in, their voices rising into a roar, and I stood frozen, my 500 rubles feeling like a weight in my pocket. I rushed home, told Elena everything, her face paling as she grabbed my arm, saying we had to get out now, but I hesitated, my mind torn between fear and the memory of those early wins, of Mavrodi's posters promising a future. I decided to wait, to give him one more chance, unaware that the shadows gathering around us were about to swallow everything I'd built. The dream was cracking, and I was too blind to see the fall coming. 1000. CapCut TTS, MMM. The morning of July 22, 1994, started like any other, the sun barely breaking through the heavy clouds over Novosibirsk. But something in the air felt wrong. A stillness that made my skin prickle. I woke early, my stomach churning as I dressed for the factory, Elena's quiet sobs from the kitchen pulling me toward her. She'd heard on the radio that MMM was in trouble. The announcer's voice grim as he spoke of a technical pause, phrase that sounded like a death knell. I tried to calm her, saying Mavrodi would fix it, that this was just a delay, but my words felt hollow, my hands trembling as I grabbed my coat. The kids sensed it too, their usual chatter replaced by wide, worried eyes, and I left the apartment with a promise to check the office, my heart sinking with every step. The streets were chaos when I got there, a sea of people shouting and shoving, their voices a mix of anger and despair. The office door was locked, a handwritten notice taped to the glass saying operations were suspended, and the crowd erupted, fists pounding the walls, tears streaming down faces I'd seen smiling just days before. I pushed forward, my 500 rubles still in my pocket from the last investment, demanding answers from a clerk who'd slipped out, but he shook his head, muttering about no money left. My legs buckled, the realization hitting me like a punch hour. Savings, the TV, the coats, all gone, swallowed by a dream that had turned to dust. I stood there, frozen, as others wailed, some collapsing to their knees, the air thick with the stench of betrayal. I ran home, my breath ragged, bursting through the door to find Elena holding Masha, both of them crying. I spilled the news, my voice cracking as I admitted we'd lost everything, the 3,000 rubles we'd built up over months vanishing overnight. She stared at me, her eyes filled with a pain I couldn't bear, and I sank to the floor, my head in my hands, the weight of my choices crushing me. The kids didn't understand, asking why we couldn't buy food, and I lied again, saying we'd figure it out, though I had no plan, no hope left. That night, we ate stale bread with water, the silence louder than any argument, and I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the image of Mavrodi's confident face mocking me from my memory. News spread fast, the radio blaring reports of MMM's collapse, estimating losses of billions of rubles, millions of lives ruined. I heard stories of people jumping from windows, of families torn apart, and each one felt like a mirror to my own fall. A neighbor, Olga, came knocking, her grandson's medicine and paid, blaming me for encouraging her, her words cutting deep as she turned away. I wanted to hide, to disappear, but the factory called me back, my boss sneering that I'd been a fool, the shame burning my cheeks. My coworkers avoided me, their silence a judgment. And I worked in a daze, the machine's hum a reminder of the life I'd lost chasing a mirage. Elena stopped speaking to me for days, her anger a wall between us, and I couldn't blame her. We sold the TV to buy groceries. The kids' new coats pawned for a fraction of their worth, and I watched Masha's face fall as she realized her books were next. I tried to explain, my voice breaking, that I'd believed in Mavrodi, that he'd given us hope when there was none, but she just turned away, her trust shattered. The streets grew quiet, the MMM offices abandoned, their neon signs dark, and I'd pass them on my way to work, my steps heavy with regret. Rumors swirled that Mavrodi had fled, taking millions, and though part of me hated him, another part wondered if he'd been forced into this, a victim of his own ambition. Desperation drove me to the market, where I begged for extra shifts, my pride gone as I hauled sacks for a few rubles. Elena took in sewing, her fingers bleeding from the needle, and we scraped by, but the gap between us widened. I'd hear the kids whisper about other families who'd lost more, some taking their lives, and the guilt ate at me, a constant ache. I couldn't escape. The factory offered no relief, the pay cuts deepening our struggle, and I started skipping meals to feed Masha and Sasha, my body weakening with every hungry night. Mavrodi's name became a curse on everyone's lips, but I couldn't fully turn against him, clinging to the memory of those early days when he'd lifted us, even if it was a lie built on sand. One evening, a letter arrived, a notice from the government investigating MMM, promising to track down the culprits. I read it with trembling hands, hoping for justice, but knowing it wouldn't bring back our money. Elena found me crying, her anger softening as she sat beside me, her hand on my shoulder, and we held each other, the first time since the crash. I told her I'd been wrong, that I'd let greed blind me, but she shook her head, saying we'd rebuild, that the kids needed us strong. That moment gave me a flicker of resolve. Though the loss still haunted me, a shadow I carried every day. The dream was dead, the future uncertain, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life MMM had destroyed. Years passed after the MMM crash, the wound it left on my life festering with every struggle. But a new chapter began to unfold in 2003 that pulled me back to that name I couldn't forget. I was 43 now, still in Novosibirsk, working long hours at the factory, my hands rough from hauling sacks, Elena and I barely holding our family together after selling nearly everything. The kids had grown quieter, Masha helping with sewing, Sasha running errands, and we'd learned to live on less. But the memory of those lost rubles haunted me like a ghost. Then one evening, the radio crackled with news that shook me to my core. Sergei Mavrodi had been caught after a year on the run, his face flashing on the screen, older, weary, but still with that sharp glint in his eyes. They said he'd been hiding in a small apartment in Moscow, living off scraps, his once grand empire reduced to nothing. The police raided the place, finding stacks of documents, some hinting at his plans to rebuild, to create a new financial system that would outsmart the old world's rules. I listened, my heart pounding, as reporters speculated he'd wanted more than money, power, a legacy, a way to prove he could reshape a broken society. He'd become a deputy in 1998, using immunity to dodge the law, but it ran out, and the government finally closed in. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness, imagining him alone, plotting in the dark, driven by a vision I'd once believed in too. Elena sat beside me, her hand on mine, saying she hoped he'd pay for what he did, but I couldn't join her anger. I remembered those early days, the hope he'd given us, the way he turned our despair into dreams, even if it ended in ruin. I didn't blame him. Not fully, part of me still saw him as a man caught in his own ambition, trying to lift us while the system crushed him. The news said he faced trial, charges of fraud piling up, and I wondered what he'd say, if he'd defend his idea or admit defeat. My loss still stung, the empty apartment a constant reminder. But I couldn't hate him, couldn't see him as just a thief when he'd once been my savior. The trial dragged on, and I followed every update, my coworkers rolling their eyes as I talked about it. In 2007, the verdict came for 0.5 years in prison, a slap on the wrist some called it, given the billions lost. They said he'd used MMM to fund a lavish life, yachts and mansions. But I pictured him differently, a dreamer who'd overreached, his genius twisted by greed. Elena shook her head, saying justice was weak. But I kept quiet, my thoughts tangled. I started working extra shifts, saving every ruble, determined to rebuild. Not for revenge but for my family. Masha got a scholarship, Sasha learned to fix bikes, and slowly, we clawed our way back, the pain of MMM fading into a scar. Mavrodi didn't stop after prison. In 2011, he launched MMM again. This time online, promising a global comeback, even tying it to Bitcoin, that new digital money people whispered about. I watched from afar, tempted to try again, but Elena's firm no held me back, her voice steady as she reminded me of the crash. Some invested, lured by his old magic, and the cycle repeated hope. Then collapse, leaving more victims. I felt a pang of sympathy, thinking he believed in his vision, that he wanted to prove it could work, even as the world turned against him. His death in 2018, a heart attack at 62, closed that chapter, and I sat with Elena, silent, remembering the man who changed my life twice. My path forward wasn't easy, the factory still a grind. But I found small joys: Masha's graduation, Sasha's first paycheck. We moved to a slightly better apartment, the walls less cracked, and I started a side job repairing radios, my hands steady with purpose. The loss of MMM left me poorer but wiser. And though I mourned what we'd lost, I couldn't shake a strange respect for Mavrodi's idea. He'd shown me what belief could do, even if it broke me, and I channeled that into building something real. Elena and I grew closer, our shared struggle a bond, and I told the kids stories of those days, not to glorify but to teach them caution. Sometimes, I'd walk past the old MMM office, now a quiet store, and think of those crowds, the hope we'd felt. I didn't blame Mavrodi for my choices, seeing him as a flawed visionary, not a villain. My life wasn't the dream I'd chased, but it was mine, pieced together with grit and love. The radio still mentions financial scams, and I listen, wary but curious, wondering if another Mavrodi might rise. For now, I focus on my family, the lessons carved into me, and the faint belief that hope, even misplaced, can spark something lasting, if you learn to hold it right.